In May 2020, as a global pandemic pushed Americans toward the water and triggered an unprecedented boom in boat sales, the assembly lines in Sturtevant, Wisconsin, went completely still. BRP abruptly announced the permanent shutdown of Evinrude outboard production. With a single press release, a 111-year-old American engine name was dead. The paradox was impossible to ignore. Dealerships were selling every hull they could find, yet the company that had literally invented the American outboard industry was being erased. For the mechanics in marina service bays, it meant the sudden loss of factory support for the direct-injected two-stroke, an engine that had defined pleasure boating for generations. But the real story of Evinrude is not only the story of a corporate shutdown in a booming market, it is the story of a boat motor brand that vanished from American docks, and how an entire way of powering the water was silenced by emissions regulations, changing fuel economics, and the collapse of a dealer network that once ruled the lake. Every week, we tell the stories of American engines, factories, machines, and industrial names that once taught the country what power sounded like, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1909. Before 1909, the American map was covered in water, but accessing it required a choice between physical exhaustion and immense wealth. If you lived in the Midwest, surrounded by the Great Lakes, winding rivers, and thousands of smaller inland lakes, getting on the water meant rowing. The alternative was the inboard engine, a heavy, permanent power plant mounted inside the hull of a vessel, connected to a fixed propeller shaft. In 1909, an inboard engine required a specialized wooden boat, complex steering linkages, and enough money to maintain a dedicated piece of maritime machinery. It was an investment. For the average American factory worker, farmer, or city dweller looking for a weekend on the lake, mechanical power did not exist. Power was human muscle. That changed in a machine shop in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Ole Evinrude, a pattern maker and machinist who had previously experimented with early automotive engines, understood that the problem with marine power was not the water, it was the weight. An engine that had to be permanently bolted into a hull was an anchor when it wasn't running. Evinrude realized that if he could consolidate the fuel tank, the engine block, the drive shafts, and the propeller into a single portable unit, he would not just be inventing a new machine, he would be inventing an entirely new way to use a boat. In 1909, he finished the prototype of what he called a detachable rowboat motor. It was a single-cylinder, water-cooled engine that produced 1.5 horsepower. It weighed exactly 62 pounds. It used a brass fuel tank mounted above a cast-iron cylinder, with a vertical crankshaft that sent power down a long metal tube to a bevel gear and a small propeller. To the modern eye, it looked like a piece of primitive plumbing, but on the docks of Milwaukee, it was a mechanical revelation. The true breakthrough of that 62-pound machine was its clamp. An American family could rent a standard wooden rowboat for a few cents, carry the Evinrude motor down to the dock, tighten two threaded clamps onto the transom, the flatback section of the boat, and instantly possess a powerboat. When the weekend was over, the engine went into the trunk of a car or the back of a wagon. It decoupled the engine from the hull. The machine did not belong to the boat, it belonged to the owner. But inventing the machine was only the first problem. The second problem was survival. A marine environment is uniquely hostile to internal combustion. An engine on a lake must operate under continuous heavy load, pushing against the density of water without the momentum coasting provides to a wheeled vehicle. It must survive constant exposure to moisture, severe vibration, and operators who were entirely unfamiliar with mechanical maintenance. Evinrude knew that if the motor broke down in the middle of a lake, it was not merely an inconvenience, it was a physical danger. To sell the engine, he had to build a system of trust. In 1909, he formed the Evinrude Motor Company. The initial production run was just 15 units, built by hand in his Milwaukee shop. They sold instantly. The next order was for 1,000 units. To scale production, Evinrude had to source aluminum castings, brass fittings, and reliable ignition components, building an early supply chain that would soon define the industrial corridor of Wisconsin. He also relied heavily on a new kind of American business infrastructure, the marine dealer network. Evinrude did not just sell motors to individuals through mail-order catalogs, though national advertising in magazines like Popular Mechanics helped build the brand. He began establishing local dealers at hardware stores, boat liveries, and lakeside bait shops across Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan. These early dealers were the first iteration of the Marina Service Network. They stocked replacement spark plugs, shear pins, small metal pins designed to break and protect the propeller if it hit a submerged rock, and the specific lubricants required to keep the early engines running. If an Evinrude motor failed, a fisherman did not have to send it back to the factory in Milwaukee. He could take it to the local dockside mechanic. This local repair culture became the foundation of the brand's durability. The motor was trusted because the parts and the knowledge to fix it were already waiting at the lake. The 1.15 horsepower motor changed the geography of the American weekend. Lakes that were too large to row across were suddenly accessible for fishing, hunting, and leisure. An entire industry of small boat builders shifted their designs to accommodate the squared-off transom needed to hold an outboard motor. The sound of a single-cylinder engine echoing across the water became the defining acoustic signature of the Midwestern summer. By 1913, Evinrude was producing nearly 10,000 motors annually. The factory lines in Milwaukee were expanding, hiring hundreds of machinists and assembly workers. The company had created an entirely new marine category, proving that internal combustion could be portable, reliable, and accessible to the American working class. But Ole Evinrude's early success attracted fierce competition. In 1913, due to his wife Bess's failing health and conflicts with his financial backers, Ole Evinrude left his own company, signing a non-compete agreement and leaving the Evinrude name in the hands of outside investors. He retreated, but he did not stop designing. When he returned to the marine industry years later with a new company called Elto, the Evinrude Light Twin Outboard, he brought an even lighter twin-cylinder engine that would set off a brutal mechanical arms race on the water. The American outboard market was no longer just an experiment. It was a fiercely contested industrial battlefield. The machine had proven it could push a boat. Now it had to prove it could build an empire. The machine that Ole Evinrude had invented was brilliant, but brilliance does not automatically survive the American industrial machine. By the late 1920s, the outboard motor market was crowded, chaotic, and brutal. Evinrude, who had left his namesake company in 1913, returned to the water in 1921 with a new brand called Elto, the Evinrude Light Twin Outboard. He had designed a twin-cylinder engine that was significantly lighter and smoother than his original single-cylinder creation. It used aluminum extensively, a metal that was still largely viewed as exotic, to reduce the physical burden on the boater. But a good engine is not an empire. An empire requires scale, capital, and the elimination of vulnerabilities. In 1929, the American outboard industry underwent a massive consolidation. Stephen Briggs, a businessman who understood manufacturing scale, convinced Ole Evinrude to merge his highly successful Elto company back together with the original Evinrude Motor Company, along with a third competitor named Lockwood. Together they formed the Outboard Motors Corporation, or OMC. This was not merely a merger of factories. It was the assembly of an engineering trust. However, the timing was catastrophic. Just months after OMC was formed, the stock market crashed, plunging America into the Great Depression. The market for leisure boats evaporated overnight. Yet OMC survived by securing government contracts and selling industrial pumps, riding out the economic collapse that destroyed dozens of smaller engine builders. One of the casualties of the Depression was the Johnson Brothers Motor Company of Waukegan, Illinois. Johnson had built a fierce reputation for high-speed, reliable outboards, but their finances had completely collapsed. In 1935, OMC bought Johnson out of bankruptcy. With that single acquisition, OMC took control of the American water. They now owned the two most trusted names in marine power, Evinrude and Johnson. Rather than killing one brand, OMC made a brilliant marketing decision that would define the industry for the next 6 decades. They kept both networks alive. Evinrude engines were built in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and marketed as the premium, sophisticated choice for the discerning boater. Johnson engines were built down the coast in Waukegan, Illinois, and sold as the rugged, dependable workhorses. Under the cowling, they increasingly shared the exact same engineering, parts, and factory DNA. But on the water, Americans argued fiercely over which brand was better. What powered both brands and the entire OMC empire was the mastery of a specific mechanical architecture. The two-stroke engine. A two-stroke engine, an engine that completes a power cycle in just two piston strokes, firing every time the piston reaches the top of the cylinder, was not a new invention, but OMC perfected it for the marine environment. Unlike a four-stroke engine, which requires heavy valves, camshafts, and a dedicated oil pan to keep internal parts lubricated, a two-stroke breathes its fuel and oil at the same time. The operator simply mixed liquid two-stroke oil directly into the gasoline can. As the fuel flowed through the carburetor and into the crankcase, the suspended oil lubricated the bearings and cylinder walls before burning in the combustion chamber. This was not just a different way to move a piston. On a Midwestern lake dock, it meant freedom from complex maintenance. A boater didn't have to worry about changing crankcase oil, adjusting complex valve trains, or dragging a 150-pound iron block to the transom. They just mixed the gas, primed the fuel bulb, pulled a rope, and embraced the distinct, blue-tinted smoke that followed. The two-stroke was incredibly power-dense. It produced massive torque for its size, allowing a relatively small motor to quickly push a heavy, water-laden hull onto a plane. OMC's mastery of the two-stroke allowed them to build a service network that was unmatched in American recreation. By the late 1940s, Evinrude and Johnson dealers were operating out of thousands of marinas, hardware stores, and boat liveries across the country. This dealer network became a defensive wall. If a boater bought an OMC product, they knew that if a water pump impeller failed or a carburetor clogged, the replacement parts were already waiting in a cardboard box at the local marina. The true test of this mechanical trust came during World War II. When civilian production was halted, OMC shifted its foundries and assembly lines to military use. They built portable fire pumps, generator engines, and specialized assault boat outboards for the U.S. Navy and Army. These engines had to survive being dropped onto beaches, submerged in salt water, and run on low-grade fuel. The military contracts forced OMC to refine their aluminum casting techniques, improve their magneto ignition systems, and standardize parts across massive production runs. When the war ended in 1945, OMC was a manufacturing juggernaut, and waiting for them was the greatest economic expansion in American history. Millions of GIs returned home, moved to the suburbs, and suddenly had disposable income and weekend leisure time. At the exact same time, aircraft factories that had been stamping out bombers shifted to producing cheap, lightweight aluminum fishing boats. The American working class no longer just wanted to rent a rowboat. They wanted to own a powerboat. And OMC was waiting at the dock with an engine that was cheap to buy, easy to fix, and impossible to kill. The Evinrude and Johnson badges became as common on the water as Ford and Chevrolet were on the highway. The dealer networks expanded from rural bait shops to massive glass-front showrooms in coastal towns and lakeside communities. The two-stroke outboard was no longer just an engine. It was the undisputed sound of the American summer. But that same dominance would later become the trap. The end of World War II triggered the greatest expansion of leisure in American history. Millions of GIs returned home, moved into new suburban developments, and found themselves with something previous generations rarely possessed: disposable income and the two-day weekend. At the exact same time, American industrial capacity was looking for a civilian purpose. The massive aircraft factories that had spent years stamping out aluminum bombers suddenly shifted their tooling to produce cheap, lightweight, riveted aluminum fishing boats. America had the water, it now had the boats. What it needed was the power to push them. OMC was waiting. The foundries in Milwaukee and Waukegan pivoted instantly from military pumps back to recreational outboards. Throughout the 1950s, the American boating market exploded, transforming from a niche hobby for fishermen into a mainstream family obsession. Boaters no longer just wanted to troll slowly for bass. They wanted to cruise across large bays, navigate coastal waters, and participate in the newest national craze: water skiing. That required a massive escalation in horsepower. The early single-cylinder and small twin-cylinder engines were no longer enough. The American transom, the reinforced back wall of the boat where the engine is clamped or bolted, was about to undergo a mechanical arms race. In 1958, OMC delivered the ultimate weapon of that era, the V4 outboard. A V4, a four-cylinder engine with two banks of cylinders arranged in a V shape around a common crankshaft, was a layout familiar to the automotive world, but packaging it inside the cowling of a marine outboard was an engineering triumph. Evinrude launched it as the 50-horsepower Starflight, while Johnson released its mechanical twin, the Super Seahorse. It was a massive, torque-heavy, two-stroke block that completely redefined what a recreational boat could do. In a Florida marina or on a vast Minnesota lake, the V4 meant that a heavy fiberglass runabout could instantly pop up onto a plane, dragging two water skiers behind it without the engine bogging down. It proved that an outboard motor could rival the power of a heavy inboard engine, but it could still be unbolted and serviced in a standard repair bay. This mechanical escalation was backed by an industrial footprint that was almost impossible for competitors to break. By the 1960s, Outboard Marine Corporation was a manufacturing titan. They did not just assemble parts bought from outside vendors. They controlled the entire metallurgical and mechanical process. They poured their own aluminum castings. They machined their own crankshafts. They built their own carburetors and magneto-ignition systems. When you bought an Evinrude or a Johnson, you were buying a machine built from raw American iron and aluminum, shaped by the industrial workforce of the Great Lakes. The true genius of the OMC empire, however, was not just the factory, it was the service network. By the late 1960s and into the 1970s, OMC commanded an estimated 60% of the American outboard market. They achieved this by turning every lakeside bait shop, coastal marina, and small-town hardware store into a fortress of the brand. An Evinrude dealer was not just a salesman, he was a mechanic. He kept a wall of cardboard boxes filled with factory replacement parts. He had the specialized pullers required to remove a stubborn flywheel, the exact shear pins needed for the propeller, and the specific water pump impellers required to keep the engine cooling system alive. The two-stroke outboard had become a cultural ritual. On a Saturday morning at a public boat ramp, the process was universal. A boater backed the trailer into the water. They took a red metal gasoline can and poured in exactly the right ratio of two-stroke oil, shaking the can to mix it. They squeezed the rubber primer bulb on the fuel line until it felt hard, signaling that fuel had reached the carburetor. They pulled the choke, turned the key, or pulled the recoil rope, and the engine fired to life in a cloud of blue-tinted smoke. That smoke, that smell of burned oil and gasoline, and that sharp, aggressive idle became the defining sensory experience of American water. By the 1970s and extending into the 1980s, the American water belonged to Outboard Marine Corporation. The horsepower wars had escalated far beyond the original V4. To push larger, heavier fiberglass base boats and offshore fishing rigs, OMC introduced massive V6 two-stroke engines. These blocks were capable of producing 150, 200, and eventually over 250 horsepower. To understand the scale of OMC during this peak, you have to look at the American factory floor. The company employed thousands of workers across vast facilities in Waukegan, Illinois, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and newer plants in places like Calhoun, Georgia. They operated massive aluminum die casting machines that slammed shut with thousands of tons of pressure, injecting molten metal to form the intricate exhaust passages of a V6 block. They were not just an engine assembler, they were a vertically integrated American industrial empire built entirely on the recreational dollar. And that dollar was flowing. The rise of televised base fishing tournaments turned the outboard motor into a highly visible gladiatorial weapon. On Saturday mornings across the South and the Midwest, a fleet of fiberglass boats would line up, and at the starting gun, dozens of OMC two-strokes would simultaneously roar to life, bearing their propellers in the water and launching across the lake. The sound was deafening, a high-pitched metallic scream characteristic of a large displacement two-stroke running at wide-open throttle. But the real glory of Evinrude and Johnson was not found on the tournament trail. It was found at the local marine dealership. By the 1980s, OMC's dealer network was an impenetrable fortress. There were thousands of authorized service centers scattered across American coastlines, rivers, and inland lakes. A marina owner in Florida, or a boat dealer in Michigan based their entire livelihood on the reliability of the OMC product. When an engine did break, the repair was universally understood. A mechanic at a local shop didn't need a laptop to diagnose a misfire. They used a timing light, a set of feeler gauges, a compression tester, and decades of accumulated institutional knowledge. They could rebuild a carburetor on a workbench while talking to the customer. The physical evidence of this empire lived on the parts counter. Behind every dealer was a rack of heavy, grease-stained OMC service manuals. These books were the Bibles of the American Marina. They contained exploded diagrams of every gear in the lower unit, every jet in the carburetor, and every winding in the stator. An Evinrude owner didn't just buy a motor. They bought access to this massive, interconnected system of mechanical support. In the fall, boaters brought their rigs into the shop for winterization, a ritual of fogging the cylinders with protective oil, draining the lower unit gear lube, and preparing the machine to sit through a harsh Midwestern freeze. In the spring, they returned to have the engine awaken. The marina was not just a retail store, it was a seasonal lifeline. In an America where a boat leaving the dock meant the difference between a ruined weekend and a saved one, marine power was not an abstraction. It was aluminum, mixed fuel, blue smoke, factory labor, and the absolute trust that the mechanic at the local marina had the parts to keep it running. OMC had trained generations of Americans to accept the inherent compromises of the two-stroke engine. Yes, they were loud. Yes, they vibrated at idle. Yes, they consumed massive amounts of gasoline. And yes, a significant portion of the fuel and oil mixture did not burn in the combustion chamber at all. Because of the way a traditional carbureted two-stroke breathes, up to 30% of the raw, unburned fuel and oil simply washed straight out through the exhaust port, exiting through the center of the propeller directly into the lake. For decades, nobody cared. The lakes were large, the fuel was relatively cheap, and the engines were virtually indestructible. OMC had achieved complete mechanical and cultural dominance. They had built an empire that felt as permanent as the water itself. OMC had taught America to trust the smoke and the sound of the two-stroke. It had not solved what would happen when the law decided that smoke was no longer legal. The first crack in the Outboard Marine Corporation empire did not happen on a factory floor, and it did not happen because Americans stopped buying boats. It happened inside a federal binder. In 1996, the Environmental Protection Agency finalized new emission standards for marine engines. The rules dictated a massive, phased reduction in hydrocarbon emissions, targeting a 75% decrease by the year 2006. For decades, the entire American marine industry had operated on a simple, accepted truth. Two-stroke engines dumped up to 30% of their unburned fuel and oil directly into the water and the air. That was the price of cheap, lightweight horsepower. But almost overnight, the regulatory landscape shifted. The government looked at the blue smoke hovering over American lakes and declared that it had to end. This regulatory pressure created a fundamental engineering problem. The easiest way to meet the new emission standards was to abandon the two-stroke entirely and build a four-stroke engine. An engine that completes intake, compression, power, and exhaust strokes across 4 distinct piston movements, keeping its lubricating oil sealed in a separate crankcase rather than burning it with the fuel. Competitors, particularly Japanese manufacturers like Honda and Yamaha, aggressively pursued the four-stroke path. They introduced outboards that were heavy and complex, but completely silent at idle and entirely smoke-free. But OMC was trapped by its own scale. They had spent over 60 years building an industrial empire dedicated almost exclusively to the two-stroke engine. Their foundries, their machining lines, their patents, and their entire engineering culture were built around that architecture. Retooling the massive plants in Waukegan and Milwaukee to cast heavy four-stroke blocks with complex cylinder heads and valve trains would require staggering amounts of capital that OMC, bloated by corporate mismanagement and high operating costs, simply did not have. So OMC made a desperate gamble. They decided to save the two-stroke. They partnered with a German firm called Ficht to develop a high-pressure direct fuel injection system. Fuel injection, a system that sprays fuel into the engine more precisely than a traditional carburetor, was not new. But direct injection on a two-stroke was radically different. The Ficht system was designed to shoot a highly pressurized mist of gasoline directly into the combustion chamber at the exact millisecond the piston sealed the exhaust port. In theory, it was a masterpiece. It promised the lightweight punch of a traditional Evinrude two-stroke, but with the clean emissions and fuel economy of a four-stroke. OMC rushed the Ficht V6 outboards into production in the late 1990s. The marketing campaigns promised a revolution on the water. Instead, they delivered a mechanical catastrophe. Almost immediately, the Ficht engines began to destroy themselves. The high-pressure injectors were incredibly sensitive to manufacturing tolerances and fuel quality. The computer systems that managed the precise timing often failed. Because the fuel was no longer washing over the internal bearings before combustion, the engines suffered severe lubrication problems. Power heads, the main engine block assembly of the outboard, began locking up. Spark plugs fouled with heavy carbon deposits after only a few hours of use. Engines exploded on the water, leaving boaters stranded miles from the dock. To understand why this destroyed Evinrude, you cannot look only at the shattered engine blocks. You have to look at the human cost at the American marina. This was the catastrophic collapse of Force 2, the dealer network. In the marine business, summer is short. If a family in Michigan or Florida spends $30,000 on a new fiberglass boat, they expect it to run on the 4th of July. When a Ficht engine blew up, the customer did not call the OMC corporate headquarters in Illinois. They towed the boat back to the local dealer. The marine mechanic, the same mechanic who had spent his entire life defending the Evinrude and Johnson names, was the one who had to stand on the dock and face the fury of a ruined vacation. OMC was overwhelmed by warranty claims. They sent replacement power heads to the dealers, but those replacement blocks often failed just as quickly. Dealerships were suddenly flooded with dead boats they could not fix, bleeding labor hours that the factory was slow to reimburse. A machine can be redesigned, but trust is much harder to rebuild. For generations, the Evinrude dealer network had been an impenetrable wall defending the brand. But the Ficht disaster broke the morale of the American marine mechanic. The men turning the wrenches lost their honor in front of their communities. Faced with furious customers and an unreliable product, survival instinct took over. Dealerships across the country quietly began making a profound shift. They took down the Evinrude and Johnson signs that had hung on their buildings for decades. In their place, they hung the blue and white signs of Yamaha. Yamaha's four-stroke engines were heavier and more expensive, but they did not blow up, and they kept the customers happy. The OMC dealers were abandoning the empire not out of malice, but out of absolute necessity. They had to protect their own livelihoods. The engines were breaking, but the real collapse was happening at the parts counter. The American Marine Dealer Network had decided that surviving the summer meant turning their backs on the company that had originally built the lake. By the end of the 1990s, Outboard Marine Corporation was bleeding out on the factory floor. The warranty claims from the Ficht disaster were draining the company's capital at a staggering rate. They were spending tens of millions of dollars replacing blown powerheads, paying angry dealers for warranty labor, and trying to re-engineer a flawed fuel delivery system while production lines were still running. But you cannot engineer your way out of a collapsed reputation. Even after OMC ironed out many of the Ficht system's technical flaws in later iterations, the name itself had become toxic on the American water. Boaters actively avoided it. The financial strain of the recall, combined with decades of corporate bloat and inefficient manufacturing processes across their massive Midwestern plants, finally broke the empire. On December 22, 2000, just days before Christmas, Outboard Marine Corporation filed for bankruptcy. The immediate human consequence was devastating. An estimated 7,000 employees were laid off. The massive foundries in Waukegan, Illinois, and the assembly lines in Milwaukee went completely dark. An American industrial giant that had once commanded 60% of the outboard market, a company that had put generations of American families on the water, simply collapsed under its own weight. But the Evinrude name was too valuable to completely throw away. In 2001, Bombardier Recreational Products, BRP, a massive Canadian power sports company, purchased the Evinrude and Johnson outboard engine assets out of bankruptcy court. BRP moved the surviving operations to a modern facility in Sturtevant, Wisconsin, and they did something remarkable. They actually fixed the engineering problem. BRP took the ashes of the Ficht system and poured immense capital into developing a highly refined, reliable version of two-stroke direct injection. They called it E-Tech. When the Evinrude E-Tech launched in 2003, it was a mechanical triumph. It met the strictest EPA and California emission standards. It produced a fraction of the smoke of an old carbureted V6. It was lighter than the competing Japanese four-strokes, and it hit with the aggressive, immediate torque that traditional two-stroke bass fishermen loved. BRP even engineered the E-Tech to require no dealer-scheduled maintenance for the first 3 years or 300 hours of use, a feature that sounded like the ultimate consumer victory. But this is where the cold reality of the American engine market set in. A brilliant machine cannot survive without a system to sell it. BRP had fixed the engine, but they could not fix the map. When an American boater decided to repower their old fiberglass hull, they didn't buy an engine directly from a factory in Wisconsin. They hitched their boat to a truck and drove to their local marina. And by the mid-2000s, that local marina was no longer an Evinrude dealer. The service network, the thousands of local mechanics, bait shops, and coastal dealerships that had once defended the OMC empire, had already migrated to Yamaha, Mercury, and Suzuki. Those mechanics had been burned so badly by the Ficht disaster that they refused to trust another direct-injected two-stroke, no matter how good the E-Tech brochure looked. Furthermore, because E-Tech engines required almost no scheduled maintenance for the first 3 years, dealers who relied on the lucrative seasonal rhythm of oil changes and winterization had very little financial incentive to push the Evinrude product over a four-stroke engine that required regular service. Force 2 had completely collapsed. The engine was spectacular, but the fortress of the American marine dealer had locked Evinrude out. For nearly 2 decades, BRP fought a grinding, uphill battle to reclaim the transom. They introduced the E-Tech G2, an incredibly advanced, radically styled two-stroke that offered integrated digital steering and massive torque. But the global marine industry had already made its decision. Boat builders were pre-rigging their new hulls exclusively with four-stroke engines at the factory. The four-stroke had become quieter, lighter, and universally trusted. Then came the spring of 2020. As a global pandemic shut down normal American travel, millions of families turned to the water. The recreational boating industry experienced a massive, unprecedented surge in sales. Marinas were emptying their showrooms, but BRP looked at their balance sheet, the shrinking market share of the two-stroke, and the staggering cost of trying to rebuild a fractured dealer network in a world that had moved on. They made a cold corporate calculation. In May 2020, they pulled the plug. The engine was fixed. The dealers were gone. The four strokes took the transom. The pandemic pushed demand. The factory line stopped. The name was retired. The machine was dead. But out on the water, the ghost of the American outboard empire refused to sink. After BRP shut down the Evinrude line in May 2020, they did not sell the brand to a competitor. They simply locked the 101-year-old name in a corporate vault, quietly signing an agreement to supply their own boat brands with Mercury four-stroke outboards. The great rival had finally won the transom. The sprawling modern facility in Sturtevant, Wisconsin, pivoted to machining components for side-by-sides and snowmobiles. The older legacy sites, the massive OMC foundries in Waukegan, Illinois, and Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where generations of machinists had poured raw aluminum into outboard blocks, had long since been demolished, redeveloped, or left as industrial ghosts on the shores of Lake Michigan. But a machine built out of heavy American aluminum does not vanish just because a corporate press release says the production line is dead. Today, the legacy of Evinrude is split into two distinct American realities. The first reality is playing out right now in modern marina service bays. Thousands of boaters still rely on Evinrude E-Techs. These are brilliant, highly advanced engines, but they are now orphaned technology. As the years pass, the specialized electronic modules, specific fuel injectors, and diagnostic tools required to keep an E-Tech running are becoming increasingly scarce. A modern outboard is not just a machine, it is a software-controlled system. When the manufacturer stops supporting the software and parts suppliers stop machining the proprietary components, the engine does not die of mechanical wear, it dies of digital starvation. Dealerships that once proudly displayed the Evinrude badge are now forced to tell loyal customers that their engine cannot be fixed, not because the iron block is bad, but because a single electronic module is on back order forever. But there is a second reality, one that exists far away from the pristine, high-end coastal marinas. In garages across the Midwest, in machine sheds in upstate New York, and on the swap meet tables of the antique Outboard Motor Club, the original OMC two-strokes refuse to die. A 1958 Evinrude Starflight V4 or a 1970s two-cylinder workhorse is a completely different kind of machine. They were built before microchips dictated the ignition timing. They were built when an engine was designed to be understood, taken apart, and rebuilt by a local mechanic using a heavy grease-stained service manual. At vintage engine shows today, collectors back aluminum boats into testing barrels, pull the recoil ropes, and fill the air with the unmistakable, aggressive bark of a carbureted two-stroke. This preservation is not merely nostalgia. It passes a much stricter test. An old Evinrude outboard sitting on an engine stand is a physical argument about how America used to understand mechanical power. It represents a time when reliability was not defined by a sealed engine block, a warranty contract, and a diagnostic laptop. Reliability was local. It was the knowledge that if the engine sputtered on a Saturday afternoon, you could pull the cowling off, clean the carburetor jets with a piece of wire, replace a sheared propeller pin, and get back on the water before sunset. It was a machine that required the operator to actively participate, to mix the fuel and oil by hand, to prime the bulb, to understand the sound of a misfire, and to know exactly how much choke was needed on a cold morning. The surprise footnote of the Evinrude shutdown is that while the modern high-tech E-techs are becoming difficult to keep alive, the ancient carbureted two-strokes are experiencing a quiet resurgence among working-class boaters. During the supply chain shortages of the recent boat boom, when modern four-strokes were impossible to buy and marina service departments were booked out for months, fishermen went into their barns and pulled out 30-year-old Evinrudes. With a fresh water pump impeller, a cheap carburetor rebuild kit, and a new tank of mixed gas, those heavy aluminum blocks fired right back up. They proved that a machine built for local repair outlives a machine built for a complex, fragile global supply chain. We traded that mechanical accessibility for progress, and the progress was necessary. The lakes are cleaner today. The federal emissions regulations worked. The blue haze of unburned fuel that used to hang over American boat ramps on a busy July weekend is gone. A modern four-stroke outboard is a marvel of engineering, silent at idle, incredibly fuel efficient, and smooth enough to balance a coin on the engine cover. America did not stop needing power on the water. It just stopped accepting the compromises of the two-stroke. The market decided that silence and efficiency were more valuable than smoke and mechanical intuition. The four-stroke won. The marinas adapted. The water stayed clean. But in that transition, something distinctly American was lost. We lost the dockside ritual. We lost the network of local mechanics who understood the engine not through a laptop screen, but through the vibration of the tiller handle and the smell of the exhaust. We lost a system of power that belonged entirely to the person who pulled the rope. Somewhere in a Midwestern garage, an old Evinrude outboard is still clamped to the wooden transom of a faded aluminum fishing boat, the fuel line disconnected, the metal cowling scratched, smelling faintly of old mixed gas, waiting for a Saturday morning that no longer sounds the same. See you in the next one.